I hereby open this academic ceremony in which Alice Giannini will defend the academic thesis Criminal Behavior and Accountability of Artificial Intelligence Systems. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your research.
Dear prorectors, dear members of the Defense Committee, family, friends, and colleagues. I'd like to start this presentation by addressing the relevance of this research. So why this research? When we think about artificial intelligence and criminal liability, the first images that come to mind are those of sci-fi movies, of robots going rogue and trying to kill us, or other homicidal artificial intelligence characters. But we might not be facing these apocalyptic scenarios just yet. But in the last 5 years, we've seen the appearance of real-life scenarios of artificial intelligence systems going bad that have started being collected by open databases such as the AI-ID or the Awful AI database. And these real-life scenarios, they validate this study's assumption, which is that the idea of artificial intelligence systems harming people and of consequently applying criminal law is not any longer a matter of science fiction, but it might just be a matter of time. And the issue will be not killer robots rebelling to human beings, but those machines that we build as super efficient purpose maximizers that will inadvertently harm us while trying to achieve the objective that we set for them. So if we establish then that it's not just a matter of science fiction, then the question is, what about legal fiction? Legal fictions help us to adapt criminal law and make it a pragmatic tool to solve social problems. Then the question is, how much legal fiction do we need? And this is what I try to find out in this research. First and foremost, when we address the topic, we need to acknowledge that there is a lack of a technical definition of artificial intelligence. And this has consequences in the fact that there's no legal definition either. And the definition of artificial intelligence has changed in time. It has gone from considering very smart computers who can beat the world chess champions to dancing robots and dancing dogs swinging to Do You Love Me? For today's presentation, what we need to acknowledge is that artificial intelligence displays certain characteristics. It's autonomous. It can act in an unpredictable manner. It can act in an unexplainable manner, which means that we might not be able to understand why it went from A to B. And this also leads us to the affirmation that they might act like criminals, so they might act in a way that is offensive to protected legal goods. Then the question becomes, should criminal law care? And I phrased this question into my research question, which is, to what extent is a theoretical framework of criminal liability for non-human agents needed and feasible? And before I go into the zoom in into the topics, there are two characteristics regarding this research. And the first characteristic is that it's a very introspective research. And by this, I mean that thinking about applying traditional human-based criminal concepts to machines make us rethink them and reanalyze them. And the second characteristic is that it involved a great deal of reasoning by proxy. And by that, I mean that since we do not have a ready set made of rules to apply to artificial intelligence systems, we had to look at alternative capacity models, and we might consider the fact that for a time we even applied criminal law to animals, that there are legal systems in which criminal liability of corporations is allowed. And then we might also take inspiration by looking at insanity rules and infancy rules. So to answer my research question, I deconstructed the criminal liability into 3 building blocks. The first one is capacity, and it will be the focus of today's presentation. Then I looked at the mental element and at the act element. So what do we mean by criminal capacity? Criminal liability has to do with ascription, and when we ascribe, we attribute something to a cause. And in criminal law, ascription refers to the mechanism by which we choose a subject as the center of reference of the norm. And it is based on a set of presumptions, so every human being above a certain age is presumed to be sane, mature, and responsive to the criminal punishment. And by responsive, we mean that she must be able to understand the criminal norm and also to question its validity. And it follows that punishment is justified only as a response directed at those who could have followed the law, but decided not to. But what are these conditions that I talk about? I identified mainly two conditions, a cognitive and a volitive requirement, that appear in different variations into national legal systems. The first one, the cognitive requirements, entails that the agent must be able to appreciate the nature of her conduct. And then the question is, what do we mean by nature? Because if we mean that the agent must understand the natural consequences of her action, so that if you hold a flame to a building, this will cause it to burn, then we might also conclude that artificial intelligence systems can fulfill this requirement quite effortlessly. That's because they have a much greater base knowledge than us, and they are incredibly better than human beings at drawing inferences. But if we mean that the agent must understand that the act was wrong, then we should ask ourselves, does the agent, in order to be criminally liable, need to understand that the act was illegal or that it was immoral? And I will focus on immorality because I believe that it poses more issues than the illegality side. So researchers have been exploring the possibility of creating moral machines for a time now. And by moral machines, we mean machines that can implement ethical principles and moral decision-making so that they behave towards human beings, but also towards machine, in a way that is ethically acceptable. And one of the most famous experiments that you see on the screen today is the MIT's moral machine that regarded self-driving cars and moral dilemmas. But there is one damning objection for now, which is that at this moment, artificial intelligence systems, they cannot figure out moral dilemmas by themselves. So they do not display the flexibility of the human mind that makes us able to make judgments about solutions that we have never faced before. It allows us to decide that pre-established rules should be broken. And it also allows us to invent new rules on the fly. And we do not have, at this moment, machines that we can qualify as fully moral agents. Moving to the control requirement, this entails that the agent should be able to control their stimuli and action according to this evaluation, this appreciation of the nature of her conduct. And on this, just a few reflections. Well, if we think about human beings and general rationality, the concept of free will has been under attack for a long time now. And in a very real sense, science tells us that we're all puppets. We are determined by the effects of gene and the environment. But at the end of the day, we do treat ourselves as if we were autonomous, because it is a legal fiction. And when we think about rationality, one attractive theory is the one to apply this economic approach to crime to artificial intelligence agents. So according to this theory, criminals are nothing but economic agents who decide to violate a criminal norm because the benefits they can gain from the violation exceed the cost. And this type of reasoning seems to apply quite well to artificial intelligence systems, and according to some scholars, you can build this sort of cost and benefit analysis into the system. When we speak of rationality, we need to take into consideration the liability of a very rational economic agent, and that is the corporation. And it is true that then when we deal with corporate criminal liability, we do see the flexibility of criminal law when we have criminal policy concerns. And when discussing liability of corporations, the premises are the same as discussing the liability of artificial intelligence systems, and that is that these traditional human concepts, they seem to struggle when they have to be applied to corporation or algorithmic wrongdoing. Also, corporate criminal liability tells us that maybe moral decision-making is not that relevant when we have to establish criminal liability. But there are two, I'd say, very relevant observations when making this comparison. And the first one is that artificial intelligence systems are not proxies for humans, as instead corporations are. And by that, I mean that when we punish the corporation, we can influence those who are behind the corporation that get the message. And it is important then that there is this organized structure behind the corporation that we struggle to identify when it comes to artificial intelligence systems. Last but not least, corporations can possess funds, so they live for making money, and when you take money away from them, you hurt them. And this kind of reasoning cannot be applied to artificial intelligence systems as of today. So moving to the answer, the conclusion of my presentation today, I decided at the end to switch the two prongs of my research question. So to first answer whether this framework would be feasible, and then to answer whether it would be needed. And I assume that this type of reasoning would also be followed by policymakers, and appeared more logical to me at the end. So moving to the now first prong of the research question, the succinct answer to this is that criminal liability of artificial intelligence agents is feasible, but it depends on how much of these anthropomorphic notions, hard word, we're willing to give up. And by this, I mean that holding artificial intelligence systems would entail either being able to create machines that are susceptible to the requirements of a legal norm, so that they're capable to learn and understand the norm autonomously, or abandoning the concept of rationality altogether. Moving to the second prong of the research question, my answer to this is that it is not needed as long as we don't treat artificial intelligence systems as members of our community, and as such, as subject to the same rules that we are. If we were to ascertain that this type of liability is needed, then we also might have to think about whether they would have a right to say something about their punishment. And if we exclude this possibility, then we need to ask ourselves whether we want to create a new generation of robotic slaves. And I believe that that shouldn't be the case. We should also ask ourselves whether it would be useful to criminalize artificial intelligence systems. And I believe that it might be useful for some sort of general deterrence of the humans behind the machine, including the corporations, avoiding to get into the headaches that I also had to go through when applying these notions to artificial intelligence systems. But at the end, we do identify less costly ways, because not everything should be regulated under criminal law. Criminal law should not be the prima ratio response towards a population sentiment. And in this sense, the criminalization of artificial intelligence systems appears today to be the costliest solution. And with this, I conclude my presentation, and I give the word back to the prorector. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor van der A. Professor van der A is Professor of Criminal Procedural Law at this university, and she is also the chair of the assessment committee. You have the floor.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Alice, I would first like to congratulate you on your innovative, topical and thought-provoking dissertation. It has an excellent substance, but I also would like to compliment you on your eloquent, mature style of writing that captivates the attention throughout the manuscript. At times, the manuscript read like a novel. It was a real page-turner. So if anybody in the audience is looking for a good Christmas gift... But I have to pose a question. And my first question was inspired by you mentioning Mulligan's paper, Revenge Against Robots, in which she states that imposing punishment on artificial intelligence systems would result in retributive benefits consisting in the psychological satisfaction of victims of AI misbehavior. Well, what I gather from your dissertation is that this assumption has not been empirically established yet. And what I would like to ask you or invite you to is to elaborate or perhaps even speculate a little more about this victimological perspective. Do you think that AI punishment would in fact satisfy victims' retributive needs and lead to psychological satisfaction? And maybe in speculating on this, you could factor in the following factors. The fact that possibly there is nobody else to punish. So how would victims feel about that? And maybe also the heterogeneity of victims in this regard. So could this perhaps vary per victim?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I do believe that Mulligan's point of view is one of a kind because she appears to be the only authors that I've encountered that takes into consideration this victim's perspective. In my knowledge, it hasn't been empirically tested yet, so that's a very good tip for future research. And I do think that when we would consider this retributive aspect, we also need to take into consideration other evidence that instead I have encountered, which is the evidence regarding the expectations that lay people have towards the behavior of artificial intelligence systems. Because toward the end of my research, I encountered experiments in moral psychology where participants were posed a number of trolley dilemma scenarios, and they were asked to assess whether the conduct, alternating when the agent was a human agent or a robotic agent, whether it would be morally permissible or impermissible, and how much blame they would assign to the agent. And I thought it was really interesting that these results were different when the agent was a human one and when it was an artificial one, in the sense that there was an expectation that the robots would make the utilitarian choice more, which is save an innocent person and kill an innocent person, and save 5 people. And they were judged less harshly for it in comparison to human beings. And at the same time, they were judged more harshly when instead they took the deontological option, which would be do nothing, and then 1 innocent person is killed, and the 4 they survive. And I think this sort of expectations should also lead to an analysis of the liability they want to assign, also in terms of what would be the satisfaction that the victims would have for them. Because if the expectation is that they would have a conduct that is different from the same expectation that they would have when there is a human wrongdoer, then I do think that should be taken into consideration, also because their satisfaction that they would expect from it would be different in that scenario. I definitely believe that at this moment, there is not yet the expectation that the machine should be punished. That's what I gained, but I also think that this is going to change, because the moment that there's more a perception of these agents being more as part of they're already part of our daily life, but more equal to us, and that might also be related to having humanized robots, for example, then I also think that this perception of expecting that the machine is punished would also be higher. So I would say this concludes my response.
Okay, can I follow up on that? I think there's some time. The reason it got me thinking was if I, for instance, hit my toe against a wall, my primary reaction would be to want to kick that wall again. I might be unique in this respect, but I can relate to victims wanting to punish the AI systems. Imagine that we were to conduct this empirical study that is really lacking in that regard, and it would turn out that indeed punishing AI systems would satisfy victims' retributive needs. Would that then tempt you to reconsider your conclusion that as of today, criminal liability of AI systems is not needed?
A highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your follow-up question. I do believe that it would not tempt me at this time if that were to be the only reason driving the introduction of this new framework, because I do believe that, as I mentioned in my last slide, is a bit of a slippery slope. And I also understand that that is a bit of a, let's say, that's a bit of a weak point when one accepts these expressive theories of punishment. So when we're talking about the expectation of the community and what it means to break the norm for the validity of the norm, that is also, you go into the field of criminal law of the enemy, and you need to be a bit careful with that. But I do think that just the pure satisfaction of victims' retribution, it wouldn't change my conclusion in this sense. I would see more arguments if we prove that, for example, by punishing the agent, we could gain general deterrence, not of the human beings, but of the other agents. And I do believe that this could be quite doable. So in that sense, I also think that you also need to consider when we're talking about machines, especially robots and machines that are involved in taking care of other subjects, elderly and so on, that we also might develop feelings different from the wall, in the sense that we might develop positive feelings in their regard. So you might establish a sort of affective relationship that might also kind of lower that sense of wanting to kick the machine that hurts you, because you also establish an affective relationship with these machines. That is also something that should be factored in, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The opposition will now be continued by Professor Picotti, who is Professor of Criminal Law at the Università di Verona. And I would like to hereby also warmly welcome you here at Maastricht University. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. I am grateful for the invitation to participate in this very important event. I know Alice Giannini because she participates also to the work of the Association Internationale de Droit Pénal in Siracusa. And my question, I congratulate for her relevant work and the survey of literature, of draft legislation, of the interdisciplinary aspect of the subject is really beautiful work, and offer for us all important stone for further work. But the question that I pose, because she offered so large basis for further development on the subject for criminal lawyer. I am criminal lawyer, and I think that you have a self-restraint at the end, and I think that, for example, on the page 238, she writes that it's not possible for you now to think criminal responsibility of a system as such, but you admit that the liable entity which are more proximity to a system could be criminal liable. And I think it's not a question that we will hold human beings criminally responsible for the sole fact that they created, used, or produced a predictable machine would be excessive, yes. But it's not for the sole fact that they created, used, or produced. I think that in this case, you renounce to find a solution by criminal law. You suggest that it is to be found in other areas of the law, such as tort law. But I think that on the basis of your survey about specific sector where like France and Germany on the traffic road, and other draft law in England, Scotland, Singapore, the work of working group of Council of Europe for provide international instrument of criminal law responsibility in such area. I think that on this basis, also on the basis of the proposal of Association Internationale de Droit Pénal, it's possible to develop a new model or adapt the model of criminal responsibility for the harm produced by AI system to the human being or entities, human entities, that corporation behind AI system. That could be a right way to give an answer that could not wait too long. Because now it's necessary, I think it is necessary to respond by criminal law to harm that are criminally if a human being cause or produce. Also an homicide in road traffic, homicide in medicine interview in the force, or other kind of harm that are criminally, if produced through directly from human, could not be remain unpunished, a criminal unpunished if there are AI systems that act. Because AI system act for interest or for advantage of a human or an entity, and sure, it's not possible to give the responsibility sole for the sole fact that is used, but you have to develop a new model for responsibility, or adapt model for responsibility to make possible to attribute criminal responsibility for that. In other ways, we have a lack, a gap of criminal responsibility that is not possible to accept, I think, because the necessity to security, to safety of the society, also the truth on this system. If there are not responsibility, a criminal responsibility for such system, there are not truth also in the market too, in the developing of such system. That is my question.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I would start answering it with the premise. When I started this study in 2019, I predicted the existence of this Chapter 7 with a bit of hope, without knowing whether specific regulation on criminal liability of artificial intelligence would rise. And Chapter 7, in this sense, proved my assumption, because as of now, there's no specific hard law regarding criminal liability of the system. But of course, the examples that I mentioned there, instead, three of them are sector-specific, one is general, as you mentioned. They address the liability of the human being behind the machine. And another general remark is that there is a bit of there is a debate saying that tells us that, well, the law seems to be always a bit slow and lagging behind when new scientific development come up, and so is the same with artificial intelligence system and technological development. But I do believe generally that being late for criminal law is not necessarily a bad thing. I believe that criminal law is indeed the last tool in the legislator toolkit. So in that sense, I don't think that necessarily it is bad that criminal law is a bit late. Looking into the specific case studies that I analyzed in Chapter 7, I would like to answer your question focusing on the English and the French examples, because I think that they're most relevant. And I would also like to add as a premise that actually the legislative process on the English side has advanced, in the sense that now there is a bill that is being discussed at the House of Lords. So it has now moved into the Autonomous Vehicles Bill, and I will refer to it in my answer with this name. So when it comes to applying human concepts that we know of, specifically in the field of negligence, which I think is the king field and the one that I discuss, in a paper that I authored with Jonathan, who's sitting here, we talked about the concept of negligence failures that I also expanded on in my dissertation. And with that concept, we refer to the fact that the building blocks of negligence, so risk-taking, foreseeability, and awareness, they struggle to help us identify a liable human being when we're dealing with artificial intelligence systems. And I have noticed a bit of a short circuit when we're looking at the human behind the machine. And I will use the French and English example to prove this. So we know that, you know that, I know that the French, they amended their Road Act to introduce this immunity clause. The immunity clause shields the individual from liability when this automated driving system is installed, provided that it is installed correctly and it's not tampered with, and protects the agent from these dynamic driving offenses that are not very specified. Similarly, the automated vehicles bills introduced this new legal concept of the user in charge. And the user in charge is a very interesting concept. It causes a shift in the liability in the sense that provided you have activated this automated driving feature correctly and that it has been previously authorized, you acquire the position of the user in charge, and that shields you from liability deriving from driving offenses. And until here, I would say, okay, everything seems to work pretty fine. But then if we need to look at the exceptions to these immunity clauses, and I think that's where we find the issue. Because when it comes to the French legal system, and similarly so in the automated vehicles bill, they both tell us that the system needs to be able to launch this request for takeover from the human being, the demande de reprise. And this entails that it is stated explicitly in the bill and in the law that the human agent needs always to be receptive and attentive to these sort of alarms of requests to take back control. She should be attentive, but at the same time, she shouldn't be monitoring the environment where she's driving, because then you wouldn't have even a partially self-driving car. And I believe this is mentioned in the Law Commission proposal. They make the example of hearing a fire drill or a phone call. You don't need to be looking at the phone or waiting for the alarm to sound to be receptive to this sort of alarm. But there are some issues because there's no specifications in any of the examples that I examined on how long this transition period should be. So we don't have a quantification of how much time it takes for the human being to receive this message and act on it. We just know that once this undetermined time has passed, then the liability becomes a traditional liability. So the immunity clauses, they stop working. And every offense that is committed after this demande de reprise, this transition period is over, then they might be imputable to the human agent. And I believe that...
Could I ask you to come to a conclusion?
Yes, sorry. Yes, and I believe that the approach to criminal liability of human agents should be very much sector-specific. I believe that we shouldn't have a negligence for all the general risks that can come from developing an unpredictable artificial intelligence systems. I do believe the approach should be tied to the specific risk connected to the agent in the field that it is used. But we're not there yet because we don't have yet the technical and safety requirements that will lead us to shape this, the average reasonable agent in this specific field. Thank you. This concludes my answer.
But we have to develop that.
Yes.
But I will not allow you to do that now. So I would now like to pass the floor to Professor Lelieur, who is Professor of Criminal Law at the Université de Strasbourg. So I would like to welcome you warmly here, even if it is only online. So you have the floor. Professor Lelieur.
Thank you very much. First of all, do you hear me properly?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Hello, Mrs. Giannini. I have just something strange on my screen. Yes, now it's right. First of all, congratulations for writing this book. You did not have an easy subject to deal with. It's a very hard question, very new question. So I think it was a hard work for you, and I think generally speaking, you did really a very good job. So congratulations, first of all. I would also like to thank Professor Klipp for inviting me to join this opposition committee. I'm a former student of the University of Maastricht, very long time ago, more than 20 years ago, but it's really a pleasure to be here today, even though I'm only on screen. It's a pleasure to participate to this event. I will come to my question, and my question goes back to the first chapter of your dissertation, the introduction, because at the end of the introduction, you give a series of examples where AI is going bad. And one of these example B, concerns predicting suicide. It's a very interesting case, I think. So I will just recall the situation. You say an AI system is used for predicting suicide attempts by applying machine learning to electronic health record of patients. You say that the system, it's just a situation. You describe a situation with a system that has 80% of accuracy. And you say that this system predicts that a person is at high risk of committing suicide. You also explain that the evaluation criteria of the system, of the machine learning system, is not the same than the criteria used by doctors. And you say the system uses hospital data like age, gender, past diagnosis, social economic status, employment status. These are not criteria that doctors use at all. And you ask a question, to my opinion, a very interesting question. What if the algorithm foresees a high suicidal risk and the doctor's clinical opinion differs, leading to a discharge of the patient, and finally, at the end of the story, the person does commit suicide? And you ask the question, should the doctor be liable for the death? We are speaking, of course, of criminal liability. Should the doctor be liable for the death of the patient?
Highly esteemed.
So,
yes.
My question is, excuse me, my question is, could you answer the question? Because I don't think you answered it at the end of the dissertation. And could you answer it?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I indeed, the example B, indeed, I drafted it taking inspiration from systems that are actually being tested with a bit of creativity to add some complicating factors. And I did not answer it in my dissertation. That is correct, because I tried as much as possible to not confuse my readers and focus on the liability of artificial intelligence systems, even though in one of my chapters I do expand a bit to the humans as an alternative option. So if I had to answer your question now, I would say it really depends if this were to happen in this stage that we are at, or in a future stage where we have achieved a sort of technical knowledge, we have achieved guidelines that expressly describe the correct behavior that should be followed by the healthcare practitioner, which is very common when it comes to the field of healthcare liability. If this were to happen now, I do believe that it would be a very, very tricky scenario. I would say that right now this would classify as a field of science where we don't really have enough knowledge to understand what the the correct, reasonable, good doctor would have to do in this situation. If I were to be the lawyer of the doctor who is being charged of murder by omission in this case, of not following his oath, I would say that he was operating in an area of science where there's no really direction, so we don't really know what is expected and how the right doctor should act. I do believe that this is quite a sci-fi scenario in the sense that we all know that before introducing this type of medical device, I would assume that it would qualify as a medical device, there are sort of technical steps that prevent from the doctor from operating in total unknowledge of the scientific base. And in this sense, this would be my prediction. If this instead were the case where this sort of tools is introduced into the daily practice of the healthcare practitioner, then in that sense, I would say, okay, we would have to ask ourselves whether the agent really complied with all the security norms, the technical norms that she had to follow. And if this were the case and the suicide would still happen, then it might just be one of these cases where our risk society has accepted that there is a certain risk that is connected to the use of these technological agents. And in this sense, it's not something new connected to artificial intelligence systems, but it is the reasoning that has been done also much more simply with airbags, for example, or security belts in car, for example. But we're not there yet, and that for me is also the biggest struggle right now, because we haven't developed these technical rules as of yet. So that concludes my answer.
Okay. Do I have time for a little follow-up question?
That there is no time at the moment, but maybe if we have a second round, there may be.
Thank
but
you.
And if not, there may be opportunities later on. But I would now like to pass the floor to Professor Simoni, who is Professor of Comparative Law at the Università di Firenze. And I would like to welcome Professor Simone here in Maastricht, even if also on screen.
Thanks. It's really a pity that I cannot be there. When I was invited to take part in Alice Giannini's defense, I immediately accepted to be on site. I excluded radically any idea to be online. This, thanks to COVID, was not possible. But I think even the very reason that since I'm not there, it's part of a circle that closes, so to say. Okay, I know Alice Giannini for all 2 years of her work, which coincided with the full second mandate of my 6 years work as a PhD candidate. At first, I was very, very much disappointed when she asked to get the co-tutel with Maastricht, because she implied that dividing with a foreign university one of the driving force of my PhD pool, and especially this driving force that supported me during the COVID time, when we were forced to stay distant, but due to her energy as a representative of the PhD students, this distance became almost non-existing. We never interacted on the scientific point of view, with one exception, which I think tends to reconnect to the explanation of my absence and can give the starting point for the question, for a volume, Freedom versus Risk, about law and COVID, to simplify, where she contributed with a paper on the Danish legal system, because among other things, she was contradicting the stereotype of the PhD student in criminal law that is saying not to speak foreign language. She compensates, she increases the average of the community. And basically, the volume exists thanks to her, because the main editor, myself, was known for the delays in producing anything. Without her daily pressures, the volume will never be seen the light. This said, let's say why Freedom versus Risk, as the title explains is a work about the balance of values. And then a little bit a starting point that I want to use to ask her to develop these two concepts of necessity and feasibility, because both necessity and feasibility in her opening, she gave some, let's say, more deeper explanation, but in any case, our concept related to cost. This is feasible after an assessment of how much this costs in social, economic terms, depends on the context. And the same for necessity. These are not simple things in the realm of law, and consider what are the values involved. I want to ask her, in case she goes deeper in her analysis, in what direction will she develop these two concepts to make them practical tools for legal policy decisions?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I think it highlights and it confirms the fact that when I drafted this research question, I was exactly thinking about what would a policymaker ask itself when having to decide whether to introduce a new liability framework or not. And indeed, the terms used come from a bit more of a technical, scientific side, especially when we talk about feasibility. And starting from this one, if you look at what we mean by the feasibility study looks at the critical points of a project, of a proposition, and then tries to assess how this could be overcome. And in this sense, instead, it's connected to the necessity, because the approach that I wanted to convey is that I would be a neutral researcher, not arguing in favor of using criminal law to fix every issue, every societal issue. So I wanted to to convey a message of distance from criminal law, and at least open myself, like I did at the end in the conclusion, to the option that criminal law might not be the solution. And the reason why, at the end, in my conclusion, I decided to switch these two prongs, so to ask first whether this would be feasible and then ask whether it would be necessary, is because I did believe that indeed this would be the logical conclusion, the logical stream of thought that would be followed by policymakers, because I believe they would first ask themselves, well, is this doable? Is it feasible? And then they would answer the question of whether it would be necessary or not. And I believe that I would assume that the conclusion right now, and there's some hints of this in chapter 7, would be, okay, well, maybe there is some arguments for its feasibility, but we just don't really need it right now. We need to look elsewhere, because the question that needs to be asked when it comes to criminal law is this really the way we need to go? Are there any other less harsh measures, softer measures, and less costly measures that we can adopt before we turn ourselves to criminal law? So in this sense, it is a cost and benefit analysis, and I'm very glad that by reading it, you also got this feeling from it. And that concludes my answer.
Thanks. Very rapidly. You described some existing legal frameworks in chapter 7, so in a quite advanced section of your dissertation. Would not have been more useful to place it earlier, just to provide a context, the scene?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your follow-up question. Indeed, I do believe this is one of the remarks that I've been given multiple times regarding the location of chapter 7, but even after having written the whole dissertation, because I was not sure if a chapter 7 wasn't even going to be there, I still believe that it is supposed to be where it is right now. And the reason for that is that I did not want to confuse my reader by opening a book with suggestions or adopted legal frameworks that regard liability of humans, because the main focus of the book is the liability of the artificial intelligence system, and I thought that it was more logical to place it at the end so that we wouldn't incur into this type of confusion in the reader.
Thanks. I find the answer really satisfying. Thanks.
Thank you. So the opposition will now be continued by Professor Roof. Professor Roof is Professor of Criminal Law at this university and also a member of the Assessment Committee. You have the floor.
Thank you. Dear candidate, also for me, sincere congratulations for an insightful and thought-provoking dissertation on one of the most challenging and topical issues in modern criminal law. You have managed to explore your research question in a manner that is firmly rooted in the status quo of the current debate, while opening up new vistas for future discussion and research. And undoubtedly, any reader is by the end of the book convinced of the necessity of this kind of doctrinal research, and that the way forward lies in continuing the path opened up by your thesis. Originally, I had a question on the retribution gap, but you succeeded in answering partly my question while answering the other questions. The fact that you're capable of answering questions that are not yet asked is already a very good sign, which I doubt artificial intelligence is capable of. So I'm going to ask my second question, which I think is even better in relationship to your presentation also. In chapter 5, you attempt to answer the question, which capacities are normatively required for AI systems to be considered as a fit subject for criminal liability. Your arguments for denying criminal capacity have mainly, in the end, one thing in common. AI lacks the mental capacities, rationality, volition, that are considered necessary for human criminal liability. But how strong is this argument for denying criminal liability of AI? Why would you base or limit the discussion of criminal capacity to these human capacities in the first place? This approach already implies an unavoidable anthropocentric and anthropomorphic bias in addressing criminal capacity for AI, and hence a predictable negative answer. Either AI lacks the human capacities, so the answer is they can't be held liable, or either AI seems to have these capacities, and the answer is they can be held liable. So, should one not first give a solid normative argument why AI liability should be based on concepts and rules that are applicable on human beings only? I ask that question also because you yourself open up that possibility. In discussing these capacities, rationality and volition, you open windows of opportunity in the sense that you frequently question the traditional human interpretation of these capacities. For example, the cognitive capacity of rationality you only find troublesome when it's understood as moral reasoning. But, and I quote you on page 137, one could even argue that requiring the defendant's ability to recognize that the crime was morally wrong to deem her criminally capable is superfluous. So, because you could have another vision on rationality, more cost-benefit and instrumentalized. Now, which form of rationality is now relevant? The human-centric or an alternative one? And similarly, and more importantly, with regard to the volitional capacity, you claim that the subject needs to be free to commit a crime. What remains unclear for me, but I think is essential, is what is meant by free. If it's the freedom we attribute to humans, then maybe we have a problem. If one is attached to the idea of free will, then obviously, as you conclude yourself, such a capacity is non-existent for programmed AI. However, this argument loses all its force the moment you take the widely accepted view of compatibilists or determinists that free will is not necessary for criminal liability, even not as a legal fiction. If that's the case, and you yourself state that on page 139, then determinism makes quite a robust argument in favor of providing for some form of punishment against AI systems, not an argument against. Again, you can hold even humans criminally liable without free will, realistic or a fiction, so why would you even need it for AI? These are intriguing statements regarding to capacities, and since this topic is not really further explored in the rest of the book, I would like to hear more of you in this regard, why this anthropocentric starting point to debate capacities to begin with, if you yourself frequently put doubts on that starting point. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. So I the specificity or the struggle, we might say, when we're dealing with artificial intelligence systems and when we're trying to assess the capacity is that when it comes to human beings, my understanding is that a crime is committed and then the criminal legal system, in case an insanity defense is raised, will try to check if certain requirements are present in the human being that is in front of us, that is behind the dock in the criminal legal trial. If we turn to corporations, instead, we have certain legal systems that give this special status of criminal capacity upon the creation of the establishment of the legal person. When it comes to artificial intelligence systems, the struggle is that we are the ones who are creating them. And then the question is, are we trying to create them as humans, so as to display the sort of ethical and moral reason that we build when during an infancy or not? And in that sense, I think that the confusion that can raise and my arguments pro and con are exactly based on this. Because my perception is that at this moment, if I looked a lot into ethical algorithms and creating these AMAs, and the perception I got is exactly that we're trying to build these systems as showing the same ethical values that we would have. And in that sense, I also ask myself, is that really necessary? Because when we look at, you don't find anything that is a perfect proxy for this kind of reasoning, because when it comes to corporation at the end, I do believe that no matter the different theory that you use to theorize corporate criminal liability, you also have this base of human beings that are behind it. And this, you don't really get that when you're talking about artificial intelligence systems. So I do myself have doubts about this anthropomorphic approach. At the end, I resort to it, indeed, because this is also the perception I have on where the science is going. But I'm skeptical about it, especially in consideration of these experiments in moral psychology that I mentioned before, because I do believe that instead the expectations are not really taken into consideration. And in that sense, if we really are trying to build machines that would always act like heroes in a situation where they have to sacrifice themselves to save a human life, then in that sense, it also means that we should also apply different rules when we punish them. In that sense, if you might punish a person for a commission by omission scenario because she had the duty to save someone, but you also expect that systems, artificial intelligence systems would risk their lives to save the drowning child, then you also need to adapt the rules of criminal liability in that regard. And before that, you also need to adapt what will be the requirements, the prerequisites of criminal liability. So I definitely acknowledge that there is this mismatch in the sense that I'm critical against anthropomorphic notions. At the same time, I did not myself find a solution at this moment to overcome this again, short circuit that is there. And I definitely would like to address more, and it's one of the fields that I would like to research on from this moment forward.
Okay. Thank you.
That gives us a couple of minutes to return to Professor Lelieur in Strasbourg. So Professor Lelieur, you have time for a second question.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask a question relative to chapter 6 of the dissertation. And especially to the end of chapter 6, you discuss the criminal liability of corporations, and you seem to say that there is no similarity between the possibility to have criminal responsibility or liability for corporations on one side and of AI system on the other side. So you seem to say that they're not comparable. And in your presentation before, at the beginning of this session, you said that it is not that they are very different because AI systems are not proxies for human beings. You said also there are no no sets of humans that it is possible who are whom we might identify behind AI systems. And well, I would like to come back to this because so first, I would like to put away from the discussion any kind of anthropocentric approach. So just compare a corporation with an AI system, but without coming back to the human being, just compare them both. Second, I would like to say you and I come from very different legal positions on this side, because in Italy, there has been a lot of skepticism against criminal liability of legal persons, and in France, not at all. So we have very different backgrounds in this discussion. Still, my question is, are you sure that they are so different? And back on your presentation, when you say AI systems are not proxies for human beings, but do you think that corporations are proxies for human beings? That's the first part of the question. And second, you say AI systems, it's not possible to identify human beings behind them. However, I think we want always to have a human in the loop. So I think there are human beings behind the tool. It's just a tool, but there are human beings behind the tool. So this is why I would like to come back on the core question, which is, what is the difference at the end of the day? What is the difference between a corporation and an IA system inside of criminal liability?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. So I would say that the first difference very shortly speaking, is that, well, we know that corporations do not have a body to kick. The same might not be the case when it comes to artificial intelligence systems, who might have also an external persona. When it comes instead to more, let's say, deeper differences, I don't believe that all corporations are proxies for humans. What I mean is that when we have an organized structure that is set and is established behind the corporation. And I don't think that it is impossible to find this when it comes to artificial intelligence systems, but it is much harder and gives way to a much more of a...
You may take a few minutes if needed to finalize your answer.
Yes, I was going to say that it does lead to a great deal of uncertainty at this moment that would struggle very much, in my opinion, with applying concepts of criminal liability. I do think that there is, of course, a set of humans that is behind the artificial intelligence systems, but more research to be done into, and we should acquire more knowledge on specifically what kind of figures are behind the artificial intelligence systems, what kind of powers do they have, what is their role in this development chain. And in that sense, I think that this is what I mean when I claim that there is no set of humans that we might identify. I would say that we require too much of abstraction at this point that is applicable, that is compliable with criminal law. And that is also why I do believe that Diamanti's theory instead is quite winning in this sense, because he relies on corporate criminal liability and the structure of the corporation to consider the artificial intelligence system as an employee of the corporation. So in that sense, I think it's quite winning because it avoids us to incur into this big deal of uncertainty on who exactly is this human in the loop, because we don't have enough strict definition of who the human in the loop is at this moment.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Alice Giannini. The time allotted for defending your thesis has now passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of the thesis and of your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberation and our return in this room.
Please all rise.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Southside, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Hit the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Alice Giannini. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the double degree of Doctor and Dottore di Ricerca. Professor Klipp is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch University custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Please all rise.
Belooft u dat u altijd volgens de beginselen van wetenschappelijke integriteit te werk zult gaan, eerlijk en zorgvuldig, transparant, onafhankelijk en verantwoordelijk?
Dat beloof ik.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Alice Giannini, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university. Cara Alice, cara giovane dottoressa di ricerca, hai appena discusso con successo la tua tesi di dottorato sul comportamento criminale e l'affidabilità dei sistemi di intelligenza artificiale. È stato intenso e quindi è giusto menzionare alcuni momenti del percorso che ti ha portato fin qui. Ci incontriamo per la prima volta il 12 marzo 2020. Nessun altro dei miei candidati per il dottorato ha mai raggiunto quest'aula così celermente. Questo può essere realizzato solo da una persona eccezionale. Per i tuoi supervisori sei stata un'ideale ed eccellente candidata, sempre preparata. Una statura trasparente sin dall'inizio, tutte le consegne rese puntuali, con indicazioni chiare sui punti da discutere. Non abbiamo mai notato crisi, né attacchi di panico, né ambizioni irrealistiche. Spesso noi supervisori non riuscivamo a reggere il ritmo rapido dei tuoi progressi. Una relazione a convegno qui, un articolo proposto lì, per non dimenticare il rapporto scritto per l'Associazione Internazionale di Diritto Penale. Durante questo periodo, poi, hai ricevuto il prestigioso premio Giulia Cavallone, ti sei sottoposta a interventi medici, hai superato l'esame per l'abilitazione alla professione di avvocata e sei entrata a far parte del network di intelligenza artificiale e neurotecnologia organizzando diverse riunioni. In ogni riunione di dottorato ci raccontavi di questa attività per poi annunciarne altre per le settimane e i mesi seguenti, fornendo a noi, supervisori, istruzioni chiare su ciò a cui prestare maggior attenzione. E tutto questo è successo nel momento di picco della crisi del Covid, in concomitanza con la stesura dei capitoli, consegnato per tempo e con pochissime cose da ritoccare dopo le nostre discussioni. Mentre ultimavi cose da ritoccare dopo le nostre discussioni. mentre ultimavi la tua tesi di dottorato, debuttavi nella docenza e ti trasferivi intanto dall'Italia nei Paesi Bassi. Alice, ma non ti fermi mai? Non stai un attimo seduta? Oppure il motivo è che l'intelligenza artificiale non smette mai di pensare? Per molto tempo noi supervisori ci siamo sforzati di dare una spiegazione a come riuscissi ad avere così tanto successo così velocemente, considerando la scelta di un argomento così difficile. Ad un certo punto però fu tutto chiaro. Tu stessa hai usato l'intelligenza artificiale. Guarda il tuo nome. Sia il tuo nome che il tuo cognome contengono AI, IA, Alice, Giannini, intelligenza artificiale. Tu stessa sei una AI. Non c'era dunque nulla che le poneva difficoltà? Fortunatamente sì. A quanto pare sei umana anche tu. Sembra che trarre conclusioni ed esporre la tua opinione non sia stato sempre facile. Dove si posiziona l'autrice Giannini, per questo ci è voluto un po' di tempo. Hai accolto a braccia aperte i Paesi Bassi come il tuo futuro paese. Hai trovato immediatamente un fidanzato olandese, hai persino provato ad andare in bicicletta, sebbene tu abbia dovuto constatare che essa non funziona con l'intelligenza artificiale. E hai iniziato a imparare l'olandese. Anche questo segue uno schema preciso. Con il tuo partner hai stabilito dei giorni in cui si parla olandese e quelli in cui si parla italiano. Ora che hai terminato la tua tesi di dottorato, penso che possiamo aumentare i giorni in cui si parla olandese. Il Dipartimento è molto felice di avere la possibilità di assumerti. Ti sei integrata perfettamente nella vita dipartimentale. Sembra che tutti ti apprezzino. Hai stretto amicizie qui. Girano voci che FAM non stia per Flavia, Alice, Renata e Monique, ma si riferisca all'organizzazione criminale Female Artificial Robotic Machine. Sta organizzando riunioni e creando un nuovo ramo di giovani penalisti dell'Associazione Internazionale di Diritto Penale. E non vediamo l'ora che tu organizzi le attività natalizie. Questa è una discussione straordinaria, in quanto si tratta di una doppia laurea in cocuntela con la facoltà di giurisprudenza dell'Università di Firenze. Un accordo specifico tra le nostre due università, il cosiddetto accordo Giannini. È stato firmato da due rettori. Sono immensamente grato al mio co-supervisore, professore Michele Pappa, per la buona e piacevole cooperazione nel corso degli ultimi anni. È stato fantastico. Grazie all'Università di Firenze e ai colleghi italiani qui presenti. Alla fine di questo percorso abbiamo scoperto che una doppia laurea comporta il triplo delle regole burocratiche. Qualsiasi altro candidato avrebbe avuto un crollo nervoso per tutti i passaggi paralleli e consecutivi che dovevano essere intrapresi a Firenze, a Maastricht e persino nel cloud. Ma non tu. Ci hai presentato un diagramma di flusso davvero notevole che abbiamo seguito con attenzione. A proposito, secondo lo schema, la discussione avrebbe dovuto svolgersi prima del 30 ottobre 2024. Alice, scrivo una tesi di dottorato, non può essere fatto senza il sostegno dei tuoi cari. Congratulazioni ai tuoi genitori per averti sostenuto nel raggiungere i tuoi traguardi. 2 dei tuoi amici ti assistono come paraninfi, molti altri partecipano alla discussione qui e alcuni guardano la cerimonia online. Ik wil ook graag Bo feliciteren. Wees trots op deze uiterst intelligente vrouw. Maar pas ook op. Ze schakelt wat sneller dan de meeste mensen en heeft het antwoord vaak al klaar voordat jij de vraag hebt bedacht. Ik dank u voor uw aandacht.
Dear Dr. Giannini, it is my pleasure to warmly congratulate you with the double degree that you have acquired. And I do so on behalf of myself, of course, but also of the Dean, Jan Smits, and of the entire Faculty of Law and Maastricht University. It is my pleasure also to now announce that there will also be a reception, and I would like to invite your company to already go to the reception. The professors and Alice will stay here for a few minutes to take a photograph with the professors also who are here online, and then one on the stairs, and then we will join your company in the reception room. And I hereby close this academic ceremony.
André doet altijd de taal van de kabine.
Ja, ik weet het. E se non è vero, ben trovato.